Hi, in this tutorial I'm going to walk you through some best practices and tips and tricks about Cityscape Pro on simpolling.com. You can go to Documentation tab and you can go to Knowledge Base. Knowledge Base has lots of useful tips and tricks. We can go through some of those in this tutorial. And there's also warning messages. Warning messages is a diagnostic tool that's integrated inside of Cityscape Pro, and it warns users about the problems with input objects and splines. It usually gives you a verbal described source of problem. Okay, so let's start with going through some of those. Okay, so the first recommendation would be to name all your scene assets that's used in Cityscape properly. That's especially useful or on large complex scenes. We can start with the surface. Then we go to our curved area spline. And then we go to our hardscape area splines. Okay, and at the end we can name our Cityscape helper. It's especially important if you have multiple Cityscape helpers in a scene. Okay, so let's pick the splines. Let's pick the curved area. Let's pick the hardscape areas. Okay, so we can go through warning messages first. Okay, so we have our basic site. We can start with the non-destructive workflow. Cityscape is a parametric tool, and it is recommended to keep it that way. What I'm trying to say is that if you go into the generated object, if you apply edit poly on top of it and do some modifications, the workflow won't be non-destructive anymore. First of all, Cityscape will detect that there's a change that's been made to the generated mesh, and it will require you to update because it's going to start flashing the button. And next is that the next time you generate, you will have a message that the curved area object has a modifier which will be lost after regeneration. It is recommended to avoid further modifications to generated geometry to keep the workflow non-destructive. It's going to give you that message, but it will regenerate everything and it will remove the edits that you did in edit poly. So unless you're absolutely finalized your work in Cityscape interface and you don't plan to do any further changes, I wouldn't recommend modifying the generated geometry. Maybe if you're exporting it to outside of 3ds Max, let's say Unreal or other game engine, that's probably when you would want to edit it. But otherwise, I would stay away from editing geometry. You probably noticed that the generate button has turned red, which means that problems are detected. In order to hide those problems, you can click the hide warnings and the warnings won't come up, but the buttons will still stay red. So yes, you can hide warnings, although in most cases those warnings are serious and need immediate attention to make sure that all the input elements are fine. Okay, so let's discuss the other common issue that can happen to anyone, which is the fact that once you import all your assets in CAD files, they often like to move stuff really far away just to accommodate the geographic information. This is not good for Cityscape because the units get less precise if you go too far away from center, and it could give you inaccurate results. So Cityscape has a diagnostic warning message for that, which tells you that your generated site is too far away from center. Let's try this. So generate, and again, tells you the curved area is too far away from the center. It can cause problems. Please move everything closer to zeros. And it still generates. And let's try to just hide these warnings. If you have a warning message and if you think that your situation is under control, you could hide warnings, although I would still recommend to fix issue instead of hiding warnings because it might come up later. Just pay close attention to those warnings and try to fix them. So if you hide warnings, message about the distant site didn't come up, but the button still stays red, which means that there's a problem here. We're just hiding it. Okay, let's move it back. Now let's discuss the other type of problem. Hide the message. Okay, so every time you use either road texture tool when you enable mapping, or when you're using the modify surface tool and regenerate, it doesn't matter if you have lakes or terrain or not. Once you enable it, the Cityscape surface modifier gets applied to your original mesh, and the Cityscape surface modifier stores all the new data about the modified mesh, about terrain, lakes, mapping information, and etc. If you like to modify the surface object after the Cityscape surface modifier is applied, it is very important to do all of those modifications under the Cityscape surface modifier, never on top of it. Let's show an example. So if we apply edit poly on top of Cityscape surface modifier, let's try, and let's regenerate. And again, Cityscape has a diagnostic warning message because it has detected that this surface object has a modifier applied on top of the Cityscape surface modifier, which might cause problems. Modifiers should be applied under the Cityscape surface modifier. Okay, so it will generate it, and it will move that modifier under the Cityscape surface. But again, it's not guaranteed that it will work smoothly. In some cases, it might cause problems. So it's highly recommended to do all the modifications under the Cityscape surface modifier. So let's say if I want to disable that noise, I can just disable that noise. And you probably notice that there's no difference. Why? Because the Cityscape surface modifier keeps generated mesh information. So if we want to see how it's going to look like on next generation, we can turn it off as well. And you can see that if you turn off the noise, the next time you generate, the Cityscape will update the Cityscape surface modifier, and that noise will disappear. So now I can see that the Cityscape surface keeps the updated mesh information, which doesn't have the noise. If you want to bring it back, we can do that, and we'll generate. And again, it will update the mesh on generation. Other one would be that the splines are too heavy. That usually happens when you're importing very heavy splines from CAD geometry without cleaning. I know that's typical, and sometimes people don't have enough time to clean it up, but I would say if you try to save time on cleaning splines, you might lose time during the project because the generation takes longer, the splines have problematic areas, etc. So I would invest some time in making sure that splines are as light as possible. They have the minimum necessary interpolation and minimum amount of vertices. I would say anything with over 3,000 actual vertices will give you a warning message that the spline is very heavy, and I would try to optimize it. We can talk about closed splines now. The most spline areas that Cityscape requires, with an exception of road texture tool, requires the splines to be closed. If we accidentally don't have a closed spline, Cityscape will give you a warning message when we generate. Curved area spline is not closed, and when you click OK, it will select the problematic spline, and it will also highlight the open area, which gives you opportunity to just select those vertices and weld them. Okay, and now once we regenerate, it's going to be fine. The other important area is to make sure that your splines don't have any self-intersection. What I mean by that is this: simulate that problem for you. So this is fine, but anything like that is a problem. That would be a problem in Cityscape and in any other tool, because it is unable to define an area. So you will get an error message when you do that. So again, we generate, and it tells you that something went wrong. Please double check the payment 01 for self-intersection. And it highlights the spline, problematic spline, and it highlights the areas that were not able to be calculated properly. So that's a useful tool for fixing that issue. Let's fix that quickly. Okay, that should do it. Okay, so the other thing that can happen is that if you have a very complex hardscape areas splines, sometimes the geometry calculations don't have enough resolution to process to build that mesh properly. So you might have some. It's a very rare occasion, but you might get some artifacts. The way it would look like is it's very difficult to simulate that problem because it happens very rarely. But it will look like something like that. Let me just manually simulate that. Okay. So if you see that your generated hardscape areas look like that, for example, like you see that the material ID goes outside of hardscape area, it means that the Cityscape Pro doesn't have enough resolution in that area. It either has too much splines on top of each other, or the spline is too complex, or there's not enough topology to achieve the desired resolution. We have a dedicated tool to fix this kind of small issues. It's called the Refine tool. And the Refine tool is located in curved area, and it's underneath the hardscape areas called Refine. So what you have to do is you pick a small rectangle. You could use any shape, but it's recommended to use rectangle because it's a very simple object. And you just pick that rectangle in your Refine area, and you will see that once you generate, Cityscape will subdivide that area. It adds a lot of poly count in that area, so now Cityscape has way more resolution in that specific area, so the chances of proper calculations are increasing dramatically. So Refine tools should fix all of those issues if you have any. Again, it's very rare, but any kind of geometry calculation sometimes needs a little bit of help from user to make sure it's working perfectly. Okay, let's look at the list. Even though we covered a lot of stuff in video tutorials, and there's so much information that I would recommend to just go through the documentation as well, just to make sure you understand all features. So we go back to knowledge base. I would like to mention the viewport settings. If you're using Nitros, I would recommend double checking this setting. You right click on this item and you go to Preview Performance. You go to Preview Presets and just make sure that this is set to basic. It shouldn't be set to advanced or DX. Otherwise, it might slow down your scene. The main reason for that is that the Cityscape Raw Texture tool uses a very complex set of procedural textures, and if you have that setting set to advanced, it might just slow down the whole scene. So yes, it's highly recommended to set it to basic, and view setting preset should be set to either standard or performance. I wouldn't recommend high quality. It doesn't really make a big difference and slows down things, so I would just do standard and basic. That's it. And the other thing to discuss is the generation stages in Cityscape Pro. So Cityscape Pro has multiple levels of generation stages. For example, if you're only changing the hardscape areas, Cityscape is buffering geometry on multiple levels, so it won't generate and calculate, for example, the modify surface items. It won't calculate the curved area because it doesn't have to, it just adds more time. So depending on what you change, Cityscape might just do a partial calculation, which saves time. And you might notice that your generation times might differ a lot. And that's the reason why it's happening, because if you're changing, let's say, the curved area, the whole curved area has to be generated. So it takes a little bit more time. But if you only change just hardscape areas or just road texture, it might just take less time. It's not visible here. It's very noticeable in large complex scenes where it takes a little bit of time to generate everything. So it might be a big time saver on large projects. And the last thing I want to talk about is the units. I know that everybody has their own way of setting up units, but in Cityscape it's recommended to set the system units setup to inches, to 1 inches. Again, you can do centimeters, millimeters. I wouldn't do millimeters, meters, but inches just gives you the best of both worlds. It gives you enough accuracy to work on small objects, and it also allows you to create large real-world textures. So I would recommend using inches in Cityscape Pro. In terms of display unit scale, that doesn't really matter. It's whatever your preference is. This is just how things are visible in viewport. It doesn't really affect the system unit scale. Okay, so now we can discuss the Cityscape Spline modifier. Cityscape Spline modifier allows you to force Cityscape Pro to use alternative calculation algorithm to achieve better results. In rare cases, Cityscape Pro might find the spline to be problematic. It might have actual problems, or it might just not work as expected. The generated mesh might have some inaccurate calculation. Other times where you might need the Cityscape spline's alternative calculation algorithm would be if you find a problematic spline and it actually freezes the software during the calculation. So if we apply Cityscape Spline modifier, once you apply it to your input spline, it has the alternative calculation checkbox enabled, and it just uses similar but a very different type of calculation method that simply just, in most cases, it just ignores the existing problems and tries to use a different path. So that could be fastest way to fix the problem. Like if you find a problematic spline that freezes as seen during the generation, or if it gives you wrong result in your generated mesh, that could be the first thing to do to fix it. And you don't have to use that modifier unless you find a problem during the generation. So again, if I just generate it with that modifier on it, there won't be any difference in our case. Yeah, it's same result, no problem. But anyways, that modifier is here when you need it, and it's a very efficient way to solve any problem related to freezing during generation or attempting to fix inaccurate calculation result. And another way to fix that would be the refine tool, but refine tool is mostly designed for small areas. Like if you find a small triangulated area that has some little bit of problem and you just want to add more mesh resolution to it to correct the calculation, refine tool might be the best thing to use. But if you find a problem on a larger scale, then the alternative calculation would be first thing to try. You can use that modifier on any input lines in Cityscape Pro, anything that takes part in geometry calculation. It probably won't matter on your road texture splines because it just generates texture, but anything related to geometry like lakes, berms, water, hardscape areas, you can apply it to any of those elements, and it will just trigger that alternative calculation algorithm. Okay, that's it, and thanks for watching.